Welcome to Perspectives, the vodcast of the American Mental Health Counselors Association with the National President and Interim CEO/ED, Dr. Beverly Smith. This vodcast will bring to you the perspectives of clinical mental health counseling as it pertains to ethics, public policy and legislation, multiculturalism and social justice, as well as leadership and advocacy. This vodcast will feature experts in the clinical mental health counseling field to enhance the work of clinical professionals and to inform the public. The American Mental Health Counselors Association advocates for over 130,000 licensed clinical mental health counselors in the United States who are licensed to assess, diagnose, and treat mental disorders. We are the only organization working exclusively for clinical mental health counselors. Join the Perspectives for insight from experts on wellness and daily living, current clinical research, integrative healthcare, as well as how to maintain personal, family, and organizational wellness in an anxious and ever-changing world. Let's connect and hear the perspectives.
Hello, I'm Dr. Beverly Smith, President and Interim CEO and ED of the American Mental Health Counselors Association. We have launched our broadcast called Perspectives, and today we will hear from Mr. Brandon Johnson. He's a public health advisor in the suicide prevention branch of SAMHSA. So, Mr. Johnson, tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to be here. So I'm Brandon Johnson. I have been in the suicide prevention field for about 9 years at this point, which is always so wild to say. But so I've, worked doing public health / mental health in every level of government. So I worked in a local health department here in Maryland. Then I went to become the director of suicide and violence prevention for the state of Maryland. And now I work at SAMHSA in the suicide prevention branch. And so my particular area of focus is young people. So I lead our Garrett Lee Smith Youth State Tribal Suicide Prevention Grant Program, which basically does suicide prevention and provides funding to states, tribes, and territories to do suicide prevention work for youth and young adults between the ages of 10 to 24. I also support the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, do some other duties as assigned, and I'm also the agency subject matter expert in Black youth suicide. So we've, submitted a report to Congress on this. We've done a number of things, connected to this. And so that's what I do, particularly at SAMHSA. Outside of SAMHSA, I have a YouTube page called the Black Mental Wellness Lounge, which is approved by SAMHSA, so I'm allowed to do it. But it's a YouTube page. Right, YouTube page specifically dedicated to having conversations around Black mental health and bringing on counselors, therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, and others, really just to have conversations around Black mental health in a safe space. And so I do that outside of my work at SAMHSA. So, passionate about this work, and again, just excited to be here and glad that you all invited me on.
We're glad that you're here. You have kind of been one of my go-to for this year when we talk about suicide prevention. Thank you for being a part of our fall summit. And congratulations again for receiving the Presidential Award this year. It was an honor for me to bestow that upon you. And so again,
I appreciate it. You know what's wild? Like on my desk, it's right here. Like I keep it.
Great.
It's literally right here on my desk.
Again, you have been one of my go-tos when we talk about suicide prevention. And now that we're in the month of May, and it is Mental Health Awareness Month, I thought it was fitting for us to kind of circle back and talk about suicide prevention and making sure that, we're giving it the appropriate attention that it deserves. So if you can, just kind of tell us from your perspective, the importance of suicide awareness, the importance of suicide prevention, particularly during the month of May, when it's American Mental Health American Mental Health Awareness Month.
Absolutely. So I think suicide prevention in the topic of suicide is one that definitely we should be talking about year round, particularly in the months of May and the months of September, May being Mental Health Awareness Month and September being Suicide Prevention Month, really just because it's a topic that still is very uncomfortable for people, right? Like there's still a huge stigma around it. People don't when engaged with it, it evokes a lot of different emotions, when we have these conversations. And I think part of the battle of us reducing suicides in our communities is really changing the conversation, allowing people to feel comfortable enough to talk about it. And especially with some of the numbers that we've seen. I mean, millions and millions of people each and every year, based on data that we have at SAMHSA, at the CDC, that says that millions of people have serious thoughts of suicide each year. And even in the millions for young people, like it's around 3 million just for young people that have serious thoughts of suicide during the year. So it's really important for us to have these conversations and engage in these conversations so people know that, one, that they're not alone, but understand that there are so many different resources that are available to help them throughout the year, that are available, many of them available 365 days of the year, that are able to help and support. And I think that once we start to normalize some of that conversation, I think we can really get people access to help without shame. That people don't feel ashamed to, contact a crisis center and maybe have mobile crisis, reach out to them, or, understand where their supports are, access, the Suicide Prevention Lifeline or Crisis Text Line, or, all these other agencies. It's really important just to understand that. And even conversations within doctors' offices, if they're asked by a clinician, have you had thoughts of suicide, that it doesn't come off as a shock to even hear that question. I think that May and September can really serve as opportunities to engage people in the conversations and get people more comfortable to a conversation that's really important for us and all the people that we serve.
But how do we engage people in a conversation about suicide prevention? How do we engage people in a conversation when there's such a big stigma around the topic? How do we do that?
I think by doing what we're doing right now, right? Like having a dedicated conversation about it, and really speaking about it in a regular facet, like just letting people know that this is, one, something that's more common, and that you're not alone. And I also think stories around recovery, I think is a big one. Having individuals with lived experience who have had suicidal thoughts or have made suicide attempts, with themselves, and have survived those, talking about their journey of recovery. What got them to the other side? Like what helped? Like what practically, were good supports, in that, in those times and in those situations. And so I think when you have people to say like, hey, this happened to me, like, these were things that I thought, these were things that I experienced, like, this is what was happening in my life at the time. And now I've learned to, manage it this way, or, have these supports, and these things work for me, and this didn't work. I think those are important conversations also. This didn't work. And so, and to do that in a way that's equitable, to do that in a way where people can see themselves. So we need young people, we need young adults, we need all different racial, ethnic backgrounds, we need LGBTQ plus individuals engaged in this conversation. Like we need a community of folks talking about this and saying, and people like, us, and, like myself, who said like, I've dedicated my career to this, right? Like there are people really working that want to change the quality of life. One of my good friends, who's a social worker, Dr. Jonathan Singer, always says, how can we get people to have lives worth living? Like, what can we do, to even change systems? And I want people to know that there are people working on so many different levels. Suicide is a very complex issue, and we're learning more about what are those social determinants of health, those things that happen in society. How does, lack of employment play? What does racism and discrimination play? How does, food deserts, and even not being able to meet your basic needs in that way, how does that play into things? Relationship issues. I think, we're having conversations even beyond mental health diagnosis around suicide prevention. And I want people to know that, like, we're not just looking at this in a very small, like, oh, if you surround yourself with happy things, like you'll be happy, but actually working towards making people's lives, lives that are comfortable, that they can thrive, and that they can be successful.
Do you think COVID-19 caused the rate to increase or go up? What are your thoughts around suicide and
Yeah.
completion and COVID-19?
So that's an interesting thing, right? It's an interesting conversation. So the most recent data that we have that's public, is the data from 2020 from the CDC. And so in looking at the data, that data has been released publicly, we actually saw a 3% decrease in the overall suicide rate in the country. It was definitely something that a lot of people were, yeah, it was.
Now we got to sit there for a second. There was a decrease, but yet we talk about COVID-19 and the long haul effects and the detrimental effect that it had on our society, individual, and our country, on the world. Mm-hmm. And so you're saying less people attempted or completed, or it's just underreported?
Less people died by suicide. I mean, I think generally speaking, suicides just in the country, I think any researcher would back me on this and say that many suicides just go unreported in the country or listed as something else, just because there's a lot of reasons behind that. And I won't go into each of those, but, so they're naturally underreported, but generally speaking, I mean, the data itself is accurate in the sense of what we have is definitely indicative of the trends. And so, with the CDC data, we saw a 3% decrease. And so, there's some different thoughts around that, but in peeling back the layers, right? So like you get that's the upfront picture. When you go a little deeper and go into it, we saw a couple of things happen. The major decrease that took place in middle-aged white individuals. That's what we saw. And because that decrease was so sharp, particularly in that age range, and so middle-aged white men is numerically, they represent a large population of individuals who died by suicide. And so because that rate and because their rate went down, their numbers went down, it drove the overall rate down.
Understandable.
But what we saw was that it increased in young people still. So around 10 to 24, we saw an increase. Some of them slight, not really, none of them were enormous, but it didn't go down. So they went up in our young people, and we saw increases in specific racial ethnic groups as well. So we saw, Black men increase, I think Hispanic males increased, American Indian, Alaska Natives increased. And so it really kind of brought up these questions of, the impact of COVID-19 and, what it meant, particularly for certain communities. Like we know disproportionately communities of color were impacted by COVID, whether it be grief and loss, so actual loss of individuals. Our young people were impacted significantly, more so than others, with the closing of schools, because one, is more likely to be a source of meals for our young people. We're more likely to have those, trusted adults and those outside supports at schools. So our kids were separated from those. And disproportionately in communities of color, businesses closed. Businesses went up significantly in communities of color. And so it's a complex conversation. We're still teasing through all the nuances of, why did the rate kind of do what it did and why did it, go down versus go up. But we've actually seen this happen during other disasters as well. I think the same thing happened during Hurricane Katrina with, in that population where, people are just kind of energized in the collective of, survival. And then when the aftermath kind of comes through, then we may see some increases. But it's 2021 data isn't public yet. And so I think it'll be telling once we get an entire year of data around this in the pandemic and kind of see what happened.
Any advice you would give to those working with school-age children, youth, versus those working with adults in helping to prevent suicide? Is the message different, or is it the same message for different age groups?
It's similar. I think that some of the things that we would do with adults, we should consider for our young people. So I think one, in various settings, whether it be in a pediatrician's office, definitely with behavioral health organizations and other healthcare organizations and emergency departments, but even at schools, we have, examples of places who've done this really well in school, is one, to screening for suicide risk, like knowing what's happening with our young people. Are they thinking about this? And then making sure individuals around them are trained in suicide prevention. So our clinicians need to be trained in suicide specific care and treatment. How to, do that with our young people, how to do screenings, how to do an assessment to see, what their risk is, and then following up with our young people, making sure that their families have everything that they need. What are the resources that they need to be able to help our young people? So it takes our community to wrap ourselves around young people and kind of meet those needs of, family members and things like that. That can be a very challenging and confusing time. I did a talk yesterday where we were talking about like what that meant for parents. Like there's a lot of guilt and things that come up with that. So like how can we, make sure our parents are supported, because they may be feeling like, listen, I thought I was doing the right thing. It must be something I'm doing that they're having these thoughts. And that's not, necessarily the case, right? And that's not often the case. And so we want to make sure that, we're supporting them. And I think the conversation directly to them is that you have supports, that you're not alone. And it's important for us as adults to be safe places and safe spaces for our children to land. Like I tell parents and people work with young people that a lot, like be a safe place to land. I think as adults, a lot of times we're like, and look, I'm a parent, I'm not saying I'm perfect, I do the same thing, but you get to this point of, you're like, what's wrong? And they're like, nothing. And you're like, I know something's wrong. I can see that something's wrong. And, if they don't want to talk in that time, it's important for us to, try to understand, to allow them to be in that space, but just let them know, if you want to talk about it at this time, the next time, like whether it's a week from now, whenever, just know that I'm here, right? And giving them reminders of that. And then when they do give us something, because it may not be everything, but when they give us something, be sure to listen without judgment, which is very, very hard for us to do, because naturally as parents, we've gone through more, as adults, we've gone through more, have more experiences. So we feel like we know like where this may go. Especially, I give this example all the time, but with young people and adults, is the topic that will get us going is a young person in a relationship. We will say, we've been there. You won't remember that person's name in like 10 years. Like, why are you so worried about that? Like, you got bigger things, like worry about those books. And yes, while we're at a point in our lives where we can look back at where we were and understood that those things didn't define us in our future later, we can think of a time where that was very real for us. That was everything that was happening around us was based in this thing. And so with our young people, they give us opportunities for us to show up. And how we show up may determine how much they're willing to talk later, how much they're willing to disclose, and if they're willing to even connect to resources that you give them, depending on how that goes. So I think those are our keys. And then just making sure that we guide them to mental health supports if needed, and making sure that we make those okay, that we don't say like, you're acting like this, you need to go to therapy. That sounds very different than, I've talked to a therapist before, and it was really helpful for me. It's definitely something that I've, it's given me really good feedback in my life. And so, that may be something you want to consider. Like, just let me know if you want to go that route too. And that's something that we can explore. Those two ways of saying it can be the difference between, this is something I can want to do, or they're going to treat me the same way as this adult who mentioned it to me. So I think that there are some differences there, and there's some nuance there, but we have some guidance on where we should kind of go with this.
So it's important how we package the message, how we deliver the message, and how we show up as adults, how we show up as professionals, for our colleagues, for our children, for our teens, and for ourselves and those who we love. We always have to be mindful to show that compassionate side, even at home, even in the office. And so we just have to remind ourselves, to remember how we package and deliver the message. Now, suicide prevention is heavy duty work. Mental health care is heavy duty work. How did you get into doing this work, and how do you find sustainability?
How, me personally or in general?
Do both.
Yeah. So I think if people are passionate about it, if someone really wants to, engage in this. I think there are many different avenues to get engaged. I think for our clinicians, I know a lot of places do suicide prevention, trainings. I would say definitely get connected to SAMHSA's mental health technology transfer centers. We call those MHTTCs for short, but they do a ton of training, some for lay people, some many of them is for clinicians, and I want to say most, if not all of them, are free. And so if you just Google SAMHSA MHTTC, they'll come right up. We have a website that has all of the information for each of the MHTTCs, and they're divided by regions across the country. So wherever you are, whatever state you're a part of, there's an MHTTC that's connected to you. And so I would definitely look for their trainings for sure. American Foundation for Suicide Prevention does local work. I would also say reach out absolutely to the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, which has a ton of free resources from SAMHSA on their website. Their website is sprc.org. Definitely check them out. They have free resources and things like that. So I think just finding out what's happening locally, I think would help. Most of our states have suicide prevention plans. If you go to sprc.org and go to the state pages, it will have all the information for the local suicide prevention coordinator. The state plan will be there, and other organizations working with it. Like, just get connected. It has contact information there. Get connected, find out what's happening. I work with a ton of states across the country, and there's so much good work happening. And so we want people to get engaged there as well. And, for me, the plan was not to go into suicide prevention. I was supposed to go into youth violence prevention. Like, that was my thing coming out of the illustrious Morgan State University. And
but universities, I have to interject, and I have to mention Tuskegee University because I'm a product of Tuskegee University. So go ahead and continue, but I gotta interject Tuskegee.
I love it. HBCU love. I love it. So I was supposed to go into that, and so I ended up. So I went to Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and got my master's in health science. So someone said when I was at Morgan, they're like, have you considered public health? And I was going to go into the clinical side of things. And, I hadn't. And once I saw it, they had a department specifically for mental health. And so I went for it, and I did my, my master's thesis on it, all this stuff. And then when I got the position at the state, it was for suicide and violence prevention, and community violence was one piece of it. But as I got in there, and a lot of my responsibilities was around suicide prevention. And the more I learned about it, and the more I understood the impact in specific communities, and, who was at risk, and, what those vulnerable populations were, I say suicide prevention kind of chose me. And so at that point, I was like, I really wanted to get engaged in this work. And so it is heavy. I think most of us in suicide prevention at some point have had that social experience where you're with other people and they're like, what do you do for a living? And I'm like, I do suicide prevention work. And everybody's like, okay, like that sounds heavy. It is something that can be heavy, but I think most of us in the field are just, I think, feel more encouraged about what's happening and what's happening to prevent this, and feeling like you're a part of that community to really save lives for people, I think is what kind of pushes us forward.
Thank you. And as we begin to close out our time together on Perspectives, first of all, thank you. But I want to know if you have any closing words for the audience on how do we advance the message of suicide prevention, or just any general closing words that you may have for the audience.
Yeah, I think definitely this is a topic that takes all of us. I know it's cliche to say we all have a part to play in suicide prevention, but it's really a true statement. There's so many different things that we can do, even if you don't want to go down the path of suicide prevention on a professional level. There are so many things that we can just do as individuals with the people around us, our families, our children, our friends. Even I would definitely say also our colleagues. And so if there are a lot of mental health counselors watching this, like, even just taking care of yourself, is suicide prevention. Like, the work that counselors and other mental health professionals do is heavy, right? Like it's a heavy thing to do, and it can come with a lot of vicarious trauma. And so just making sure, even if you don't have the energy to take care of anyone else or don't have that big circle, take care of yourself. Check in with yourself, see how you're doing, and don't be afraid to reach out for supports and to get connected, to other supports. We have to support our supports is something that I've been pushing for Mental Health Month this year, is supporting our supports. And so, I just want I want this to be as common as we talk about, cardiovascular health or, breast cancer or spraining a knee or like a hurt back. Like we talk about suicide prevention the same way. And just like, yeah, I had these thoughts, did this, this worked for me, and just build community so we can, help people feel supported and not alone in this journey.
Thank you, Mr. Brandon Johnson, for your message. Thank you for being a guest on Perspectives, and thank you for reminding us that it is important to normalize the conversation, to talk about suicide prevention. That is important. It does take a community, take all of us. And I love the last piece that you mentioned. It's important to support the supporter, for supporters to do the self-care and lean on each other as we continue to advance the awareness of suicide prevention. Again, thank you for being our guest on Perspectives with the American Mental Health Counselors Association. Thank you so much, Mr. Johnson.
No problem. Thanks for having me.